This month we've been looking at the last book of the Bible, Revelations. That's how people usually answer the question. If you ask them what's the last book of the Bible, it's Revelations, plural, with an S in the end. That's the common knowledge. Well, it's actually Revelation, singular. Common knowledge, well, there's no guarantee that common knowledge is accurate. There's a lot of things that we hear kicked around as common knowledge that, you only use 10% of your brain. That's not right. That the fruit in the Garden of Eden, what was the fruit in the Garden of Eden? Was it an apple? Don't know. Common knowledge says it's an apple. The word in Hebrew is just fruit. Later on in history, someone painted the scene and chose to use an apple to display, to sort of had to paint some sort of fruit. And so that's how the apple got associated with it. It's a painting, it's not in the Bible. The Vikings had horns on their helmets. If I asked you to draw a Viking, you'd draw the helmet with these big curved horns on them. That's another common knowledge thing, except they actually didn't have horns on them. It has become common knowledge, thus, to say that the last book of the Bible is Revelations, and it's a book that tells us what the future holds, that if we just understand it properly, that we'll have the key to understanding the end times. And so there are ways of reading Revelation that say that based upon their reading, there's 144,000 people that are going to be saved, and that's it, no more. If your name is not one of the 144,000, you're not going to make it. Jesus is going to come back. There's going to be a 1,000-year reign. They're called the millennium. There's going to be a great battle, Armageddon, fought with the Antichrist, and everyone goes off to heaven, and we leave this world behind. Like, that is a common knowledge way of reading Revelation. At least it's one I've come across many, many times. Except that's not actually what Revelation says. Sometimes the reason that common knowledge goes astray is easy to figure out in a very simple story. Viking helmets have horns on them. That comes from an illustration used for music composed by Richard Wagner, a German dude, wrote very heavy music. And there was a illustration used with that publishing of that music, and the way to make Vikings look really tough. Well, how do you make someone look tough? You put horns on their helmet. That's it. It's simple reason for why it goes sideways. Sometimes the story for why some piece of common knowledge goes sideways takes a little bit more explaining, and that's definitely the case with Revelation. How did Revelation go off the rails? How did it become a book that is scary and misinterpreted so often? Okay, it's a little bit longer story, and to really understand it, I'm going to go back to what I'd said 2 weeks ago about how to read Revelation well is like reading a political cartoon. And let's take a step back on that image, because it ends up being helpful. You find a political cartoon, historically speaking, in a newspaper. And so a newspaper is a collection of various writings of various genres. The front page has to be read different than the opinion page, different than sports, different than a political cartoon. They're each different genres with different assumptions and rules. You will not find, or should not find, opinions on the front page. You'll find nothing but opinions in letters to the editor. You may find opinions on the sports page. That's kind of, we know these rules because we're familiar with what a newspaper is. We're familiar with this genre, which is actually a collection of genres. And so if I hand a newspaper to someone in 100 years, how much of the paper they'll be able to understand depends upon how familiar they are with this culture. If we're still playing baseball and football in the same way we are today, they'll be able to read the sports page. They will be able to read the front page, because that's news is going to stick around to sort of, here are the facts of the day. Opinions, the letters to the editor, those will still stick around. The political cartoons, it depends if America still exists when you hand someone a paper in 100 years. Will someone be able to understand the the imagery that goes into a political cartoon. Will they understand what elephants and Democrats refer to, or will there be different political parties? If you go back in time, early in American history, you wouldn't find elephants and Democrats because there weren't Republicans and Democrats as there are today. And it just depends upon the understanding of culture and context. If we look at the Bible, it is in some interesting ways similar to a newspaper, in that it is the genre of the Bible is that it is a collection of genres. A newspaper has front page, opinion page, letter to the editor, sports, etc., for sale. The Bible has many genres as well. It has the records of what Jesus did. We call them the Gospels. And those are different than the letters of Paul, written to specific churches on specific instances. Whenever Paul writes a letter, it's because there's a problem, right? So he is always responding to a problem, except for Romans, which is a different discussion for another time. But then there are the letters of John. There's the kind of random one-off letters, the letter to Philemon the letter involving Philemon and Onesimus, right? Hebrews, what is the letter of Hebrews? It's really not a letter. It's kind of a sermon-ish thing. Like, each one of these is its own genre. And if you think back to how the Bible was put together, the New Testament was put together as churches talked to each other. Over the first centuries, as churches talked to each other, there would be one church that was the church where Mark lived, or had lived, and so they'd have the Markan version of what we now call the Gospel of Mark, and maybe they would have one or two letters of Paul from communities that were close to them. And then they were talking to a church from a different part of the known world that had, maybe they had the Gospel according to Luke and the Gospel according to John, or they had two other Gospels, and they would trade. Like, there was this sense of trading. Here's the letter we have from Paul, here's the gospel we copied from another church. And so over time, the churches of the Roman Empire traded what they had amongst themselves, each letter being a moment where God had moved in the work of the church to create this moment, right? This experience. And these letters, these gospels, were recordings of this. And so as they shared them, they came to this moment. It was in 382 AD that there was a formal recognition of what had already effectively happened. In 382 AD, at the Council of Rome, the bishops, the leaders of the church, sat down and said, it has become clear to us, we have a second piece of this thing called the Bible. Because up till then, there was the Bible, which we now call the Old Testament, and then there was these other pieces of writing that involved what Jesus's works, life, death, and resurrection. And so they sit down in 382, and they say that these are the books that will form this thing called the New Testament. And these are the books, and what we see amongst these books is that they are accepted by the entire church, like the churches of the Roman Empire have used these books for centuries now, and we acknowledge that these are what the churches are using in worship. These are the books that are teaching people who Jesus is. So they are accepted by all the churches. They're connected back to the first century. These are the books that are connected back to this first century. They're not later additions or something someone tried to tack on. And then the third sort of requirement, or the third acknowledgement to be in the Bible, the New Testament, was they cohere. All of them make sense together. We don't have any sort of outliers. There were books that were considered and were not included. There's a book called The Shepherd of Hermas that was not included. There's a couple others. And Revelation was on the edge. They were not sure in the year 382 AD if they should include it. And it is the real risk there that they were considering is, will people be able to make sense of this? It met all the criteria, right? It was accepted by the whole church. It connected back to Jesus. It made sense in the overall sense of the story. It cohered with the rest of the books of the Bible. But what they were running into was that the way of reading that genre, the apocalyptic genre, was being lost. The apocalyptic genre was used between 200 BC and 100 AD as a way for God to give hope to people in hard situations. So it was used in the second half of the book of Daniel, and it was used in Revelation. There are other apocalyptic writings. These are the two that were used by the church to express their faith. And what happened was, after about 100 AD, this type of writing, this genre, faded out. It wasn't used anymore. And so the question was, if we put this in the Bible, is it going to either be ignored or misinterpreted? In the end, I think they made the right call in that they put it in, but it promptly began to be ignored and misinterpreted. And the most common way of misinterpreting Revelation began, in modern times, began back in 1827. In 1827, there is a priest in England hanging out and recovering following a horrible leg injury. It required surgery, extended recovery, and this guy's name was John Darby. He was a part of the church called the Exclusive Brethren. And as you might guess by its name, the Exclusive Brethren were exclusive. If you didn't agree with them, you were not welcome. The Exclusive Brethren understood that they needed to withdraw from the world, be apart, be different from the world, because the world was wrong and evil, and that way of seeing the world is going to show up in how John Darby reads the book of Revelation. And so he is laid up as he is recovering. His femur is broken. He's had to have surgery. He's a gunshot wound, as best I remember, as I checking the history. I believe that's what happened. He was convinced that the church was corrupt and useless. He was laid up for a while. He didn't want to waste his time just laying there in recovery. And so he started writing a commentary on Revelation. And the thing was, he was on the painkiller of the day, laudanum, which is morphine dissolved in alcohol. And morphine has two very well-known side effects: itching and hallucinations. And so someone who is bitter at the overall church, believes the world is evil and wrong and we need to withdraw from it, is writing a commentary on the book of Revelation while taking heavy doses of a hallucinogenic drug. This goes about as poorly as you expect. But he started reading Revelation and it started making sense to him. He wants everyone to know what he has figured out. And so he goes to America to convince the people of the New World that the end times are coming, and he knows how it's all going to go down. And so people start gathering every year for what's called the Niagara Bible Conference to learn this way of reading Revelation. At that conference, a fellow named Cyrus Scofield is there. And he is convinced that it's so important that people understand this that he creates what becomes known as the first study Bible, the Scofield Study Bible. You can still find it in print today. Another person who gets on board with this is a guy by the last name of Ryrie. So the Ryrie Study Bible. These are some of the first study Bibles ever created, the Scofield and the Ryrie. You may have one on your shelf. If so, read the Bible, don't read the note to the bottom. But people are reading this for the first time. This is like the invention of the study Bible, and so they are assuming that the notes at the bottom are as authoritative as the text at top, the actual text of the Bible. And so a seminary is formed to teach this way of reading Revelation, Dallas Theological Seminary, still there today, DTS, down in Texas. And people are continuing to use this. You get books like the late great Planet Earth, the Left Behind series. These are all based upon this guy's way of reading Revelation. And so what John Darby has figured out, he reads Revelation in the context of the whole Bible, and he's going to figure it all out. What he reads is that when Israel is promised that it will be made a nation again, when it will come out of exile. Israel is the 12 tribes who come out of Egypt, settle in the promised land, then that nation of 12 tribes gets split into a northern and a southern, and so the northern gets destroyed by invasion by Assyria. The southern is taken into exile by Babylon. They are promised while they are in exile that they will be returned. They will come out of exile. They will refound and rebuild the nation. And that's what happens, right? We have the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that tell us that's what happens. The temple is rebuilt. There is weeping. There is crying. It's a big deal. Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the wall, the rebuilding of the temples, the refounding of the nation. John Darby reads this and he says, no, that's not actually what happened. The promise was that the Jewish people would come out of exile and they would refound the nation. But Ezra and Nehemiah, that's not actually the refounding of the nation. We're still waiting for the Jewish people to refound the nation, to rebuild Jerusalem and to restart the timeline of moving us towards the end of time. And if you think that sounds a little bit off the rails and kind of, it's pretty bold for John Darby to ignore Ezra and Nehemiah and say, I know better, but that's just kind of how he rolls. So he makes an assumption. He makes the assumption that the Jewish people still need to refound their nation so that we can get back online to moving to the end of times. And second, that this can't happen until all the Christians are gone. Why? Because Darby assumes that Christians and Jews can't live together, which again, the dude's assumptions are just bracing. But what he says is we got to get all of the Christians out of the way so the Jews can rebuild Jerusalem and Israel. And so he's reading along and he finds this comment in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. When Paul is explaining to some of the earliest Christians, 1 Thessalonians is the first book written in the New Testament. He is explaining to Christians who are struggling with death for the first time as Christians, that we do not grieve as those who are without hope, that we will turn towards the future and we will be rejoined with our Heavenly Father and Jesus, His Son. The Spirit will move, we'll be connected to the people who have gone before us. And the way he describes this reunion is that we will be lifted into the air, which makes sense in that worldview because air, up, heaven, like lifted into the air. And it's symbolic language because, I mean, you got to talk about going somewhere, and he's not sure exactly how to explain it, but heaven, up, like, it makes sense, right? To be reunited after death. Well, Darby reads this and says, well, obviously, this is the rapture. If you've ever heard the term rapture, this is where it comes from. It is one verse in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. It's not in Revelation. I think is a misreading of the Bible, but it feeds into Darby's way of reading this, that the Jews have to rebuild Jerusalem, Christians have to get out of the way, the rapture is how all the Christians will go poof. And after that happens, then there'll be a face-off with the Antichrist. The word Antichrist doesn't show up in Revelation. It's not there. The Antichrist shows up in one place in the New Testament. It shows up in the letters of John, and it talks about the Antichrist is the person who denies the Father and the Son, 1 John 2. This is how you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit which confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God, and every spirit which does not confess Jesus is not of God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist. For many of deceivers have gone into the world, men who will not acknowledge the coming of Jesus. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. The Antichrist, if you just read what John says, is anyone who denies Jesus, anyone who will not acknowledge the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. So there is no Antichrist in Revelation, and there is no one Antichrist. Anyone who denies that Jesus is who Jesus says he is against Jesus. And that if anyone who denies I am who I say I am, that I am a follower, that I'm a father, that I'm all the things I am. If someone says that no, you're not, then they're an anti-Andy. Like anyone who denies you is anti-you. Like it's Antichrist is not one person. Antichrist is just literally what the word means. They're against what Christ is doing. And so that's not how Darby reads it, though. Darby reads it as being Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, Luther, the Reformation, Napoleon Kaiser, Wilhelm Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, Henry Kissinger, like all these people over the years have been accused of being the Antichrist by Darby and those who follow him. And then the mark of the beast for those who follow the Antichrist is either Social Security cards, UPCs, QR codes, all these different ways we have to track things today. But that's not what is actually happening in Revelation. First, Antichrist doesn't show up in Revelation. And second, we start talking about the beasts of Revelation and the mark of the beast. A beast in apocalyptic writing stands for an empire. And so the beast in Revelation has 7 heads. Rome was founded on the 7 hills of Rome, right? The Roman Empire. So it's Rome. And the beast has, one of the heads has 10 horns. As of the writing of Revelation, there had been 10 Caesars, 10 emperors of Rome. One of the horns had died and lives again, and there was a rumor at the time that Nero had died and lived again. The mark of the beast, thus, was for anyone who cooperated with Rome. Anyone who cooperated with Rome was thus be able to work and shop. It would be allowed to be part of the business dealings of the Roman Empire, and the mark of the beast would be something like a chalk mark on the hand, or just a list of who was allowed in. Like, it was just a bookkeeping thing to keep track of who was willing to toe the line and worship the Roman gods. And if you weren't willing to worship the Roman gods, you were not allowed to be part of the Roman economy. And then the mark of the beast, 666, comes from the letters and numbers in Hebrew. The first letter of the alphabet is Aleph, and Aleph also was the sign for 1. There weren't separate symbols for numbers. So Aleph 1, Beit is 2, Gemel is 3, Dalet is 4, right? And so those are the first 4 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, or Aleph Beit. And so if you add up the value of the letters, which are also numbers in a person's name, you could come up with a number. And so the number 666 is the number that you get if you add up the value of the letters of Caesar Nero, the guy who was persecuting Christians. So the mark of the beast, the number of the beast, 666, it's referring back to Rome. Caesar Nero was the guy who was using Christians as tiki torches. And so, yes, his name being the number 666, like, that's where that comes from. The last piece of craziness that we'll look at today that comes from John Darby's reading of Revelation is the talking about the millennium, right? So that all the Christians have to be gotten out of the way by the rapture, so that there could be the Jews refounding their nation, so we can move the timeline of the end of the world, keep on moving that up. And we have the mark of the beast, and we have the Antichrist fighting, and then this all happens before the millennium, the 1,000-year rule that happens in Revelation 20. Revelation 20 never actually says that Jesus will return. It says an angel comes down. And it does not say that Jesus will bind Satan for this 1,000-year rule, but it says that Jesus' servants will bind Satan and will bind him for 1,000 years. Now remember that numbers in Revelation are symbolic, and so the number 10 is the number of completion, and so 10 times 10 times 10, 1,000 is the number of completely, and so Satan will be completely bound by people who are being faithful to Jesus Christ. That's what this is talking about. So those who follow Jesus will bind him completely out of living their faithfulness. Okay. All of this weaves together in a way that makes sense if you accept Darby's assumptions, which were admittedly a little bit crazy. How do you know that what I'm telling you today is trustworthy? Well, what I can tell you is that over the last 200 years, we've made discoveries such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have found other apocalypses, and frankly, we've relearned how to read them. And it has been a failing of the church to not take the time to really fully explore and explain this. The early church fathers, the bishops who gathered to finalize what was in the Bible, their concern about Revelation being misinterpreted turned out to be rather accurate. And it's only, as I said, in the last 2 centuries that we really have been able to read Revelation and read it in the way that the Jews of the first century, for whom it was written, could understand it. And what they understood is that Revelation was written to them to give them hope. It's not to give them hope for something that would happen thousands of years down the road. It was written to give them hope for what they were going through that day under the persecutions of the Roman Empire being led by Domitian. And so they needed the hope of a new age coming, and so they were looking towards that new age on the other side of Domitian, and Revelation told them that new age would come, and indeed it did. And so what we read in Revelation is not a prediction of the end of the world. What we read is that it was written to bolster the faith of persecuted Christians who are holding on to their faith even in the face of death. Revelation was good news then because they could have faith that they would be sustained through the rough times in front of them. And it's good news today not because it tells us of an exact timeline, but because it tells us what is true, that no matter how weird, how disturbing, and how frustrating our current politics have become, back then or today, the kingdom of God is coming and our hope is rooted in the future. And so we can enjoy what we can do today. We can endure what we must endure today. We can serve however we can doing so today and trust that the kingdom of God is over the horizon. It is coming, and for that we give thanks to God. Amen.